Howdy.
Today.
Looks like a pretty small turnout. Do you think it's just going to be us?
Might be. Robert's out running an errand. He's got to get his Manitoba driver's license. So, yeah, he won't be joining us today.
Yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and people show up and show up. All right. The usual spec sig, then we'll talk about our repo. I feel like the spec sig should be pretty quick. I think the main thing is they want to start transitioning like a lot of the metrics spec work to the specification sig. There's kind of been like a separate like metrics meeting on Thursdays. They're going to keep both of them for a little while, but I think they want to dedicate at least like half of the spec sig meeting to metrics talk, just to kind of, I don't know. I think there's like a realization that most people have been so focused on tracing that only a select few have been participating in metrics. So they still want to keep that meeting to like talk about the hard problems, I guess, but still kind of talk about the decisions that have been made and other things at the spec sig, just to get people spinning up on metrics, I guess, get a wider audience kind of spinning up on them. And I think the long-term plan is when they feel like they don't need that Thursday meeting any longer, it would just kind of take place at the Tuesday meeting. If that makes sense. And then on that note, they did kind of bring up this rename label to attribute issue. I know we've talked about this a few times, but it does seem like this is something that people are very interested in doing. Like, despite the fact that most backends, most metrics backends expect values to be labels, I think, wait, what did I say? Values to be strings. Like, yeah, it's true that that is the case today, but I think that might not be the case for metrics systems of the future, and you are kind of like limiting them if you do restrict things to strings. So I think there's still kind of this idea that the APIs at least should accommodate more types, and then the export pipeline can handle those as needed for the backend. I would tend to agree with that for most things, but I think like once you start to get into like these exotic value types that we have for attributes, like arrays or maps, like it gets weirder for sure. But that thing was glossed over a little bit. And like the other reason, I think as we covered before, is that like you want to be able to attach like a resource maybe to your metrics, or reuse some bucket of attributes that you're putting on a span for metrics. And it's like, you can't really do that. And it's painful for the user, at least, to have to understand that, to understand the metrics restrictions from that angle, and convert your attributes to labels and vice versa. Um, so yeah, I think ultimately this is something they're working through. Any questions, comments, aversions?
No, it doesn't particularly bother me at the moment. Yeah, I think it'll be a little while before we start tackling metrics.
Yeah. And I think that's fine. I think, like, the people who have been on the bleeding edge of metrics have kind of implemented their metric systems a few times. And I feel like a lot of some of the existing implementations out there are definitely dated. They're definitely like a previous version of kind of the budding metrics spec. And I think that just makes it more confusing. There is also a PR here to add more histogram types to the proto. I think I tried to read through this a while ago and realized that I need to study statistics before any of this makes any kind of sense. Yeah. My understanding is this will just make the histogram representations a lot more flexible and be able to use some fancy math beyond kind of like your just usual basic histogram model. So mostly the rest of the meeting was spent talking about this. So these other items didn't really get a fair share, but this was talked about yesterday at the maintainers meeting and kind of talked about today. And I think the plan is this document is going to become an OTEP. And it's really about, like, as we start releasing things as stable, like make a stable tracing release, how should things work? What are these stability guarantees, and kind of how versioning and other such things should work. So yeah, like I think initially people were thinking about, yeah, actually, I don't know all of the details of what is going to happen, but I think, like, the one thing that is becoming obvious is that things will have to follow semantic versioning for reasons of package management, if nothing else. I know, like, I think there were definitely some other schemes people were looking at that were a little bit more like cutting corners, I think, on SemVer, and people were kind of just bringing up the point where, like, even if metrics is, unstable, like, if people are using it, there will be, if you have like a fuzzy, like, minor version matching or something, you can kind of pick up something that will end up breaking. You can actually pick up breaking changes. So I know they want to make sure that that this doesn't happen in most cases.
How are they proposing to deal with the fact that matrix is not stable? So we're kind of going to have, stable tracing APIs. And if we do a 1.0 release with a stable tracing, but metrics not yet implemented, then as we add metric support and while the spec is changing, like, are we going to be doing a new major release every time we do a breaking change to the metrics API?
I guess maybe this is implied with the unstable. It looks like, looking at this, like 1.0 will be the stable tracing, context, and baggage. And then 2.0 will be metrics. So I guess anywhere in your 1.0, people should not rely on metrics not being broken, I guess. And then,
okay, so this implies that we are doing a major, sorry, there was some text up above here. If this occurs, tracing metrics, blah, 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 we'll do a major version bump for each signal release. So every time we do a breaking change for metrics, that's going to be a major version bump, even if tracing is not changing.
yeah, it seems like, I guess, the way I'm reading this is you will probably get 1.0 for tracing, 2.0 for metrics when we've frozen metrics, but I guess in the whole 1.0 branch, you are free to break metrics because they're experimental. There's no stability guarantee on them at that point. So yeah, I think there's some, sorry. Yeah, there's definitely like a hard backwards compatibility requirement on the API. And I think, yeah, for like languages that compile, I think there are issues and potentially issues with when OpenTelemetry starts shipping with as like first party instrumentation with other libraries where you kind of don't have the control over like your API dependency. The expectation is that things should work. People should always be able to be on like the most current version of OpenTelemetry, and there should not be issues. I don't know how that works out in practice because I feel like there usually are issues when something depends on like too old of a version of something. But I guess this is something maybe we'll have to think through for Ruby, how that will work. But
yeah, it's just going to be interesting. I'll have to read this document closely to see what it means for us. But yeah, it just feels like it's going to be a little bit weird while we're developing the metrics API.
yeah. Yeah. I guess we'll have to think about that. I suppose like with metrics API development, like, I'm just thinking out loud, but would it make sense that, like, we know that the metrics API is going to repeatedly break until we reach stability in 2.0. So like if people are trying to experimentally use metrics, they should have fairly tight versioning. And if we just kind of made a policy of we will increment the minor version for every breaking metrics change, then as long as people who want to experiment with metrics but not be broken, they would have to, they could pick up patch releases, but they would have to, knowingly and willingly pick up the minor releases and expect some breakage. I think that sounds somewhat reasonable.
Yeah, our alternative is to develop the metrics API in a separate gem until it reaches stability, and then deprecate that gem in favor of moving it all into the main OpenTelemetry API gem.
Yeah, that also sounds reasonable. I think that that's something to keep in mind, because some people might not be interested in metrics at all until they're GA'd. So for people who are just using tracing and we keep pushing out like, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.90, like people who are just interested in tracing might not really care. And we might spare them the worry of trying to upgrade or regularly upgrade.
One other question about versioning. At some point soon, we're going to start releasing diverging versions of some of the gems. Like right now, we've been releasing all of them every time. So we're at like 090 of everything. But I think now that the API has stabilized, particularly for tracing, we're soon going to want to start, having a 010 of the SDK with the 090 of the API, for example, and some of the instrumentation may like not change for a while. Is there an expectation with this versioning document that we're going to release, we're going to continue to have the same version number for the API and SDK moving forward, or is it okay for them to diverge?
So I think it's a good question. I'm just thinking through this. So it seems like the major versions should match for API and SDK, perhaps. Does that make sense? Because like for metrics, for example, like there is an API component.
I mean, for tracing, the API is evolving quite slowly at the moment. There's only one significant change, and I don't know if it would be considered a breaking change, which is the addition of trace state that I'm working on. Everything else is pretty stable at this point, whereas SDK is going to probably have some, well, I don't want to say probably, but possibly have breaking changes, especially if we change the configuration mechanism, for example.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I expect API to move a lot more slowly than SDK now that I think through all the possible ways that we can break the SDK, and would want to have a major version bump as a result. So I think that's true. And I think that probably makes sense. we should yeah, we should see what this document says, if anything.
Oh, here we go. Sorry, if you just scroll up a second, there was a comment about that here. Version numbers. All packages within a release receive the same version number. Breaking change in any part of the release results in a major version bump. So package, okay. So it seems like we want to keep them in lockstep then. I don't know if that would be true of instrumentation gems, but certainly SDK and API gems, it seems like they will need to remain in lockstep.
How do they define releases here?
So I think, I mean, for at least for API, I feel like that makes, I feel like I at least understand what constitutes an API release, and that is they freeze the spec like at certain levels, I guess. But yeah, I don't know how they're defining release for things like SDK and other components, because I don't know, we're fairly autonomous with these things. So I don't know if the things, every time we push out a package, is that a release, or is it more centralized, as in every time something has changed at the spec level? But I feel like every time we push out a package, that must be a release.
I think so. I think that's the implication here. By keeping version numbers in lockstep, end users can understand which packages belong to which release. So I think the expectation is we're going to be doing, 0, 10, 0 with both API and SDK changing.
So
yeah, I'm actually not sure. I would love to. Is there a link to this doc? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late here, but I'd love to look at this a little bit more closely, because it seems to imply that releases span packages. Like there is a larger concept of a release, rather than, oh, I updated something in a package, I'm going to do a release. The implication here seems like that they've defined some concept of, okay, we're doing a milestone whatever release of whatever is affected by that milestone, and so I think it would be useful to understand what that is, because otherwise, say for whatever reason we make a we make a breaking change to SDK because we decided that we need to change something in how configuration happens. It doesn't make sense for that to then force a December major release of API and everything else because we did that change. It suggests to me that they want to do I kind of want to understand this a little bit more before we put policy in place.
Yeah, I chatted the link, and I know they talked about possibly trying to spin up a meeting around this document itself. So if I hear of anything, I can at least mention it in the Ruby Getter. But I think the goal is to turn this document into an OTEP ultimately. So so there will be some like debates over a PR at some point also. And I think Ted wanted to have that up sometime this week. So, but yeah, like as we talk through this, it does seem like a little ridiculous to have to like bump the API version, which should be like incredibly stable, like when you make a breaking change to the SDK.
Yeah, I kind of imagine that we're going to hit 1.0 on the API, and then the SDK, we're going to be at 1.27.3 at some point without any intervening releases of the API.
Yeah, and I think, if you wanted to have any kind of like versioning lineup, like at most, I would say like major versions, because then you're, yeah, like if you fix to a major version, I think that would allow you to at least have some signal as to like what's compatible with things, but not have to release. Definitely not have to release like API repeatedly, and probably the instrumentation repeatedly when you have to keep making improvements to the SDK. But even that, I think, is probably gonna be too much, just because I think you are going to make breaking changes to the SDK and probably not make breaking changes to the API. So I could see like SDK version 5.0 still working with API version 1.0 potentially. But yeah, like I think keeping version numbers in lockstep is probably probably a huge hassle and hard to keep up with. Keeping major versions in sync might be something worth considering, but still possibly not feasible, at least for things like API. I could see maybe doing that for like SDK and instrumentation, maybe. But
Cool. Is there other stuff we want to chat about?
so this was kind of the end really of the spec sig. This kind of ran out of time.
I'm not surprised.
But yeah, I think this is the big ticket item right now, I think. Yeah. Should we move on to our repo?
Sure. Yeah. We cut a new release, a little rocky, but we got it out. So 090. We have a couple of, I think we have one breaking change maybe that went in since then, and a couple of other minor things. We may want to do, this actually brings up version numbering. We may want to do another release of the SDK, and possibly, I think, the common package in SDK. Didn't really want to release everything else, but yeah.
Was this the thing that Eric ran into?
I think so. I haven't replicated it, but it made sense. Common was requiring the API, but it didn't add the dependency to the gem spec. So I fixed that. I was hoping Eric would be here today so I could ask him whether that actually fixed his problem. Yeah, so that was a, actually, was that a breaking change? I don't remember. Do you want to take a look at pull requests here and take a look at the closed ones? Oh, so the breaking change was actually allowing samplers to modify trace state. So that's a change to the SDK, but nothing else. It's actually a slightly frustrating change because it requires an allocation where before we didn't need one. But
All right.
But anyway, yeah, this is this only affects the SDK, doesn't affect any other gems. I don't know if we want to do a 0.10.0 release of all the gems or just 0.10.0 of the SDK.
Yeah, I mean, up until this point, things have been matching on the minor version anyways.
Yeah, now we can wait until I release the trace state change. Right now, trace state is going to be somewhat unusable for most people. So once I actually implement trace state as a class, then that's going to affect the propagators and everything that's using it. So the API will also have a breaking change. So if we wait for that, then we can just do 0.10.0 and release all the gems.
Yeah, what is the motivation for potentially cutting a release sooner?
The main reason I probably should have cut a release before this breaking change. The main reason is fixing the SDK install problem.
And that's this common gem.
That's this one here,
depending on
yeah.
API gem.
Yep.
Is it possible to cut a release from something from
Yep.
my commit
Yeah,
other
I
than
think-
head?
Yeah, I think so. I think we can release from an earlier version.
I am actually not entirely sure that's true, but I can.
Oh, okay, because you can probably release from a branch, but not from a.
It's always been, well, the yeah, I'm actually not sure. I'll take a look and get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, either way, like if it's easy enough to just release this change as a patch release, that might be the easy thing to do, and just
yeah, arguably you could do a 0.9.1 release of just the common gem, and because that's not actually affected by the change in 487. So that's the other way of thinking about it.
yeah.
I guess you'd need, you'd need the SDK to depend on the common gem, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how that would actually work.
Yeah. Either way, I guess. Whatever reasonable plan we have around a next release and versioning, I think we can do that. I think the ultimate plan will, or ultimately the plan will be dictated by what is possible in our release process to some degree. So,
Cool. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm working on trace state implementation. Hopefully that'll be done this week. So Robert and I, or Robert in particular, is focused on getting things to a point in OpenTelemetry Ruby where we can start deploying it in production as soon as possible. So Ruby Kafka instrumentation is one that he needs to get out soon. So he's got a PR open for that. The other thing that we know of that we need to work on is metrics from the OTLP exporter. So we kind of need to figure out a way of reporting metrics, given that we don't have a metrics API.
So you would like to export metrics as in the OTLP format?
No. What I want to do is actually instrument the OTLP exporter so that we have metrics about drop span counts and number of export calls, successful calls, failed calls, all that stuff. We want to be able to report those metrics from the OTLP exporter, but report them using some other mechanism. So basically something pluggable so that we can, in our case, use statsd to do the metric reporting. The ultimate, like eventually once we implement OpenTelemetry metrics, then the metrics should be reported using that API, but that API doesn't really exist yet. So we need to do something else. Whether that's something where we end up like monkey patching a bunch of stuff, so we just have a bunch of like empty hook methods, or we actually formally or more formally define something. I don't know.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like we would need a at least semi-functional metrics API, which I think our API is actually somewhat out of date from what is currently out there. I would have to relook, but when I was kind of glancing at it, it was not looking a lot like, I think.
It's changed a lot, like the API has changed significantly.
And then yeah, you would kind of need, a decent amount of the SDK pipeline to actually kind of make this work. You would need a place to kind of aggregate the metrics as they're being recorded, and then.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking about because we're so far away from implementing the metrics API and SDK, and the metrics API is so far from stability. I was thinking of having some either a bunch of methods in the OTLP exporter that we can just like either subclass and override or monkey patch these empty methods that are reporting metrics, or have you could arguably use active support notifications if you want, but we don't really want to have that dependency. Or we just define some interface that allows somebody to plug in an implementation of like metric reporting from OTLP exporter. And actually, in fairness, it's not just the OTLP exporter, it would also be the batch span processor that would need instrumentation.
This all makes sense. I know somewhere in some spec. Oh, is it here? Yeah, like I was just thinking, like some languages have just like export result of like just okay, like success or failure, kind of like the Java version here. Go has one that's a little bit more um, it can carry a little bit more information. So I could see your exporter use case going one of a couple ways, I guess. And like one way would be to um, add some hooks into the exporter. I guess the other one would be to have like a more richly decorated export result, and like potentially you could just subclass the exporter and
Yeah, right now our export result is basically just success and failure. Success, failure, and timed out, I think, is the other one.
would it be I'm just throwing out ideas. I'm not saying that they're good or should be done, but would potentially having like a more rich export result and just kind of subclassing the exporter from Shop or for Shopify to kind of add this quick and dirty stats D metrics recording.
It might. I don't know if it's going to be, well, in order to make it rich enough, you're probably going to have a fairly complex export result. Like you want to know information about how many retries were there, what were the error codes from the retries.
If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. I was just throwing it out there. Like the one thing I'm wondering about is if we're just gonna end up with like a bunch of like hooks that are gonna become like vestigial, like as soon as we actually have a proper metrics API.
There may be. I mean, these are also things that I mean, we can kind of declare them API private or something, and just document them as being there for monkey patching if you need it. Ultimately, those same spots would be like those methods would eventually be filled in with things that are recording metrics using OpenTelemetry's metrics API.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense. We can add these hook methods. They can be API private. They can be legitimately private, and pretty much just be like template methods with no implementation. And then we could safely remove those when we introduce a metrics API.
Or just actually provide behavior. We don't need to remove them. Like we won't end up breaking anybody if we keep them around. Right.
Yeah, I guess that sounds good. Like if these methods, yeah, if we can add in the methods for the behavior that we want and retain them and just kind of leave them as something that are monkey patchable for you for now, and then fill them in with the implementation once we have a metrics API. That sounds like a good plan. So yeah, TLDR, you know what you want, you know what you need, and anything reasonable, I think we're happy to add in.
Cool. Yeah, we can hash it out in a PR. That's fine. This is a question for you, actually. There was a question that came up about Lightstep propagation. Does Lightstep have a propagator for OTel Ruby? I noticed that you have wrapper packages for a bunch of other languages, Go and Python and whatever else, that set up sort of reasonable defaults for things. So pretty similar to what we have in Shopify. We have wrapper packages for Go and for Ruby. Is this something that you're planning for OpenTelemetry Ruby?
Good question. We'll probably end up with a wrapper package at some point. We haven't introduced Lightstep propagators for Hotel yet. It's something that we've been talking about. Most of our tracing clients support B3, so it's kind of like this idea that was like a common denominator between everything. So I can at least mention that on this issue and see if that helps Johnny for now.
Does Lightstep have its own propagation header?
Yeah, and it's kind of this weird thing where it's kind of like the unofficial open tracing context propagation format. So like it's questionable whether it's exactly the Lightstep format or not, but it is definitely the Lightstep format. A few other people have adopted it, but it's kind of one of the more official, unofficial open tracing headers, if that makes sense. Like open tracing was kind of, it went so far as to specify a tracing API and stopped there. But a lot of people adopted kind of the Lightstep format as the open tracing context prop format. So there might be some interest outside of Lightstep for such a propagator, but yeah, obviously I think this issue belongs to me in some way, so I'll at least mention B3 as a solution for now, and then I'll have some conversations at Lightstep and see what our plan is for this.
Yeah, ultimately the any vendor-specific propagators or any propagators that are not part of the ones that are defined. So I think Jaeger, Zipkin, and Traceparent. The spec is pretty clear that they must not be provided as part of the standard packages. So I think Lightstep would need to provide them themselves.
Yeah, I would expect that any gem containing this would be in the Lightstep org. So yeah, I will lay out some options. I think B3 is an option. I think cutting and pasting some stuff from our tracing clients and turning it into Hotel would also be an option. Like, I always hesitate doing this. It's like, I don't know, anybody who has implemented propagators for multiple formats will probably have similar stories. I hope that they have similar stories, because it's always like, oh, it's easy, we'll just add another propagator, and then you add another propagator, and then it takes like 6 months of people using them to find situations where it didn't work for them, and then several days of debugging to figure out exactly what went wrong, and then fixing the problem. Like, just, I don't know, it's just so easy to mess up, and yeah, easy to mess up and hard to find out why and where. But yeah, this is something that I can handle. Anything else we should cover?
Not really. Oh yeah, sorry. There was actually a request on the pull request from, I think the other Francis, was it? was interested. Yeah, he was asking, do we want him to continue working on this or something else?
I think we do kind of want this in some way. Or we at least wanted some of the behavior from this. So the one thing that I'm just that I'm remembering that kind of I think maybe I created the issue that this yeah, that this was trying to solve. And I think the issue still remains to some degree. And I think the issue is that if invalid attributes are added to like a span, at a bare minimum, the Jaeger exporter was breaking. And so like, I think one of the common things is just like a nil. Like a nil is like a value for a span will break the Jaeger exporter. And I think the spirit of this PR was just that like we should keep invalid data from entering the export pipeline, and that would free all exporters to be able to kind of just trust the data that they're getting. I mean, we could approach this by addressing stuff in the export pipeline, though. It's like it doesn't have to be that solution. So I guess that would be one question to ask is.
Yeah, so since then, I mean, the spec has become pretty clear about null handling, and that, well, I mean, sorry, maybe not super clear, but it at least calls out null handling and says that, you know, you can't have null valued attributes, you can't have nulls in array valued attributes. But it says that doing so is undefined behavior.
Yeah, so for me, undefined, I think we can add that definition, but my instinct would be to drop invalid attributes. And I think,
yeah, there's not much else we can do. It's either drop or log and drop. We certainly don't want to be raising exceptions at that point because the error handling spec says that we shouldn't be raising exceptions there. So yeah, I think the question here was whether we wanted to be doing that validation eagerly when the attribute is added or lazily when the span is actually finished.
so I think good question. I think we talked about it a little bit in this PR and kind of I think the idea was, I think there's like a mixed approach, if I recall, and one of the ideas was things that are obviously invalid early on should be dropped, so there was some validation that happened up front. And that data would be dropped so that we don't retain memory for it. And then I feel like there was some validation that happened on finish here as well. So we should drop attributes that exceed max limits eagerly. Validate types at span finish time. So I think that's what we decided here.
Okay, so that is drop attributes that exceed max limits. So that's not talking about the size of attributes, it's talking about the count of attributes. If I understand what you're getting at there.
Yeah. This is based on a meeting we had back in March. So like,
You don't recall this?
I mean, I recall the conversation, and
Yeah, I think this makes sense because you're not going to be, like, if you're not checking types until finish time, then you're not determining, is this a string that is longer than X, right? Equally. So really the only thing we're looking at is making sure we're not retaining more than n strings per span. And then we do the actual type validation and length validation at the end.
yeah, and I think that makes sense, and it kind of goes with, it's like a very pragmatic way for us to like not retain too much memory. So like those upfront checks for just the number of things seems pretty easy to do and low overhead, whereas eventually we're gonna have to iterate the collection and do some work on it, and we can do the type checking and size, length, size, length, whatever you want to call it, checking on each attribute there. Yeah. Does this still sound reasonable?
I think it seems reasonable. Yeah, there's always caveats around if you're adding invalid attributes, they're potentially pushing out valid attributes. And then by the end, when you do the final validation, you end up with no attributes. But I think that is a corner case that maybe we don't care about dealing with at this point. So I guess the only question here is, do we want Francis to pick this up or not? I think we probably do. So
yeah, I think we probably do. And it sounds like we're still in favor of the scheme we talked about back in March. So yeah. I think one of us can let him know that we'd be happy if he would pick this back up. Yeah.
We're a couple of minutes over. I didn't have anything else. Was there anything else you wanted to chat about?
On the releases, so I was looking at how things work. It is possible, but there's some manual work required to do a release from a branch. The good news is I don't think we need to here. So common, I think we can go ahead and release 091 of common just normally because nothing else has changed in common. And I don't think we need to do another release of SDK with a dependency bump on common, because SDK already depends on API. And so I mean, the only change to common is that it would depend on an API. So I mean, that change would be a no-op on the SDK side.
And the way the dependency from SDK to common is specified, will that result in sort of new installations just picking up 091 instead of 090 of common?
Only if they bundle update, but that's also true if we bump SDK, you know, people won't get it unless they bundle update. So it's, again, I think it's not, I don't think there is a benefit.
Okay, cool. So maybe you just cut a release of common only at 091.
Yeah, and I think we can call that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so like new releases will be totally fine, and anybody that runs into it, we can just tell them bundle update on Gitter.
Cool. Sounds good.
But the question about releasing from a branch is a good one. It's complicated because it means that we have to update the change log in a branch and then copy that update back into master, and there's additional steps that need to happen there. So it's possible to do some of those steps manually, and I can write up how to do that if that's something that we think will be useful to have. I'm not yet sure whether it makes sense to build the capability into the tooling. We'll have to see how often we run into this sort of thing.
I think we should try to avoid it if possible.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
I will try to stop making silly mistakes.
Yeah, I think if we don't have like a need to regularly release from a branch, it probably doesn't make sense to accommodate it. But if we do make that part of our workflow, then we can investigate it. And for now, I mean, silly mistakes are probably going to happen, but I think hopefully we can work around it. Yeah. Anything else we should talk about?
No, that's it from me.
I was just going to mention, I will get some eyes on this Ruby Kafka instrumentation. I know Robert asked for it last week. It was Thanksgiving here, so we had a few days off, but I know this is something that Shopify would like, so you can start using everything in production. So yeah, I'll have a look through it, but generally I feel like if you know what you need, and if it's working for you, then I think it's a
yeah, this is not tested in production or anything like that yet, so I am also going to review that. I started reviewing it yesterday, but I will keep plugging away at it today, and yeah, when I'm happy with it, I'll give it a thumbs up. But if you can also take a look before we actually merge it, that'd be great.
Cool, will do. All right, well, see everybody next week.
Cool. Yeah. See ya.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.